I've been a caretaker my whole life. That's what my daughter Tanya always says about me, and I suppose she's right. I spent 34 years as a facilities manager for a school district in Savannah, Georgia, fixing what was broken, keeping the lights on, making sure everything ran the way it was supposed to. When my wife Lois passed away 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer, I kept right on doing the same thing, taking care of the house, taking care of Tanya, taking care of everybody except myself. I'm 63 years old. I'm not a tall man, not a particularly handsome one either. I've got gray at my temples and a bad knee from a fall I took in 2019. I drive a used pickup truck and I wear the same 3 pairs of boots on rotation. Most people look at me and see exactly what I want them to see. A retired working man living a simple, quiet life. What they don't see is the property. My father-in-law, God rest his soul, was a man named Earl Hutchins. Earl grew up poor in Beaufort County and spent 50 years buying up land whenever he could scrape together the money. He wasn't flashy about it. He just believed in land the way some men believe in Scripture. When he died in 2017, he left everything to Lois, and when Lois passed, it all came to me. 12 acres outside of Savannah, a rental duplex on the east side of town, a small commercial property on Route 17 that brings in steady lease income, and the house I live in, which is paid off and sits on 2 acres of mature oak trees. I don't talk about any of it. I learned that from Earl himself. He used to say the same thing every Thanksgiving: don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. I didn't fully understand that when I was younger. I understand it now. I met Deborah at a grief support group at our church, St. Mal, Andrews Baptist, about 14 months ago. She came in on a Tuesday night looking like she hadn't slept in a week, carrying a paper cup of coffee and sitting down in the back row like she was ready to bolt if anyone said the wrong thing. I noticed her because she reminded me a little of Lois, not in her face, but in the way she held herself, like she was used to carrying things alone and didn't want help but wouldn't refuse it either. We started talking after the meetings. Nothing romantic, not at first. Just 2 people who understood what it felt like to have someone there one day and gone the next. Her husband Alan had died from a heart attack 18 months before. She had a son, Marcus. Wait, I can't use that name. Her son's name was Derek. He was 22, lived about 40 minutes away in Brunswick, and apparently called his mother every single day, which I thought was a good sign about her. Women who raise sons who actually call them tend to be decent people. That's not a rule, but it's held up pretty well in my experience. Deborah was a bookkeeper, worked part-time for 3 small businesses in town, handled their accounts, kept things organized. She was sharp with numbers and she knew it. She wasn't flashy, drove a Honda Accord with a dent in the rear bumper that she kept meaning to fix, wore her hair natural, always had a cross necklace on. She was 58 years old and looked exactly like a woman who had earned every year of it. We dated for about 8 months before things got serious. I liked her. I genuinely liked her. She was funny in a dry, quiet way that took you by surprise. She remembered things you said weeks later. She showed up when she said she would. On paper, she was everything you'd want. I never told her about the properties. I didn't decide to keep it from her out of suspicion, not at first. It started because I just didn't want to deal with it. The change in energy that happens when people find out you have something. I'd seen it before with distant relatives after Earl passed. Suddenly cousins I hadn't heard from in years were calling Lois, wanting to visit, wanting to reconnect. I was tired of that dynamic. So when Deborah asked what I did in retirement, I told her I did some handyman work around the neighborhood and collected a modest pension from the school district. Both things were true. I just didn't mention the rest. She seemed to appreciate that I wasn't flashy. She told me once that her late husband Alan had made good money in sales and spent every dollar of it the same week he earned it. She said she was done with men who were all show. She said she wanted someone steady, someone real. I told her I was exactly that, and I meant it. My daughter Tanya, who is 36 and works as a nurse practitioner in Atlanta, had concerns from the beginning. She drove down to meet Deborah after about 2 months, took us both to dinner at a place on River Street, and was perfectly polite all evening. On the drive home, she called me and said, "Daddy, something feels off about her. I can't tell you what it is. I just feel it." I told her she was being protective. She said, "You're right, I am, because someone has to be." My friend Hugh, who I've known since high school, said something similar. Hugh is not a subtle man. He told me over coffee one morning, Ray, that's what he calls me. My middle name is Raymond. That woman is nice as pie to your face. I want to know how she talks about you when you're not around. I told him he watched too much true crime television. He said, and you don't watch enough. I should have listened to both of them. Deborah and I got engaged in September. It happened quietly. At home, no big production. I'd bought a simple ring, nothing extravagant. She cried and said yes and called Derek on speakerphone while I stood there feeling, for the first time in years, like maybe the second half of life wasn't going to be just maintenance and waiting. We got married at the courthouse on a Thursday in November with Tanya and Hugh as witnesses. Deborah had wanted something bigger, but I'm a private man, and she accepted that. We had dinner afterward at a steakhouse, came home, and that was that. Married at 63. I wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or terrified, so I felt both. The first sign came on Saturday morning, 36 hours after we got married. I was in the kitchen making coffee when Deborah came downstairs with her phone and sat down at the table with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Focused, businesslike, not unkind, but not warm either. She said, I've been thinking about the house. I said, what about it? She said, it's on 2 acres, right? That's a lot of maintenance, and it's a little far from everything. I was looking at some listings last night. There are some really nice townhomes in Pooler, closer to the highway, easier to keep up. It might be smart to sell and get something that works better for both of us. I stood there with my coffee and I didn't say anything for a moment. We had been married for 36 hours. We had not discussed selling my house before the wedding. We had not discussed it at all. I said, this house has been in my family for years. She said, I know, and I respect that, but we have to think practically. A townhome would appreciate better, and we'd have cash left over to invest. I've actually been running some numbers. I said, you've been running numbers? She said, I just want us to be smart about our future. I nodded and said I'd think about it. But something had shifted in my chest, a quiet feeling, like a key turning in a lock. I didn't say anything else about it that day. I watched. I paid attention to things I had not been paying close attention to before. The way she moved through my house like she was measuring it, the comments she made about my furniture being dated, the way she mentioned twice that her name wasn't on the deed and said it with just a slight edge in her voice that she quickly covered with a smile. On Sunday afternoon, Derek came to visit. I had met Derek twice before the wedding. He'd seemed fine, a little quiet, a little watchful, but polite enough. That afternoon he came in, shook my hand, sat down in my living room, and spent the first 20 minutes talking to his mother in a low voice while I was in the other room. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The house is small, and my hearing is better than people think it is. I heard him say, so he actually doesn't have anything saved, and I heard Deborah say, just the pension and the handyman stuff, but the house is paid off, that's what matters. And Derek said, what's it worth? She told him. She'd looked it up. He said, and the 2 acres. She said, I'm working on it. I stood very still in the kitchen. I heard my own heartbeat. I set down the glass I was holding carefully so it wouldn't make a sound, and I stood there for a long moment, just breathing slowly. I'm working on it. I walked back into the living room and I sat down and I looked at both of them and I said, what are you two talking about? Derek smiled and said they were just catching up. Deborah put her hand on my knee and said she was telling Derek about the neighborhood. Her voice was perfectly smooth, not a flutter. That was the moment I understood who I was dealing with. That evening, after Derek left, I told Deborah I needed to go check on a property I was caretaking for an old family friend that had been my cover story for the duplex when she'd asked once about where I went on certain afternoons. She nodded and said okay, kissed me on the cheek and told me not to be too late. I drove to Tanya's friend's house and I sat in the parking lot and I called Tanya. I told her everything. What I'd overheard, the conversation about the house, the questions about the acreage, all of it. Tanya was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Daddy, I need you to call Mr. Foulds tomorrow morning. Douglas Foulds is my attorney, has been for 12 years. I said, it's been 3 days, Tanya. She said, I know what day it is. Call him. I called Douglas on Monday morning. I told him I'd gotten married and I had some concerns and I needed to understand where I stood. He asked me several questions. I answered them honestly. He told me that because the properties had been in my possession prior to the marriage and were titled solely in my name, and because we had signed no prenuptial agreement but also no community property documents adding her name, she had limited claim under Georgia law, but that it would be important not to add her to any titles, not to commingle any accounts, and to document everything going forward. I thanked him and sat with that information for 2 days. Here is what I knew by Tuesday evening. Deborah had married me believing I was a retired school district employee with a paid-off house, a small pension, and no real assets beyond what she could see. She had not asked me once in 8 months whether there was more to my financial picture. She had not pushed, not pried. She had been patient and pleasant and let me be exactly what I appeared to be. And within 36 hours of the wedding, she had begun to move. The precision of the timing was what got me, not the greed. I understand greed. It's human. What got me was the patience. The months of patience, the warmth, the tears at church, all of it sitting on top of a calculation I had not seen. I had thought I was being careful. I had thought she was genuine. I had thought, and this is the part that hurt most, that her grief was real. Maybe it was. Maybe you can be grieving and calculating at the same time. I genuinely don't know. On Wednesday, I cooked dinner. I made smothered pork chops and rice, which was one of the first meals I'd ever cooked for Deborah, back when she came to the house for the first time and said it was the best thing she'd eaten in years. I set the table properly. I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving. She came downstairs dressed nicely, and she smiled when she saw the table, and she said, "What's the occasion?" I said, "I just want to talk." We sat down and I let her eat most of her food before I said anything. Then I put my fork down and I said, "I owe you an apology." She looked up. I said, "I haven't been completely honest with you about my situation." She set her wine glass down slowly. I said, "I'm not just a retired facilities manager with a pension and a house. The house sits on 2 acres that I own outright. I also own a rental duplex on the east side of Savannah. I own a commercial property on Route 17 that I lease to 2 businesses. And I hold the deed to 12 acres of land in Beaufort County that I inherited from my late wife's family. All of it is in my name alone, and all of it has been there the entire time we've been together." She didn't say anything. Her face went through about 4 different things in the space of 3 seconds. Surprise, then something calculating, then a version of warmth that appeared a beat too late to be real. She said, "Honey, why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I wanted to know who I was marrying." She said, "That's not fair. I should have known that before we." I said, "You should have. You're right. And I've already spoken to my attorney about how things are structured and how they'll remain structured going forward. I also want to tell you that I'm aware of the conversation you had with your son on Sunday afternoon." The warmth left her face. Not quickly. She was too controlled for that, but it left. I said, "I'm not angry. I want you to understand that. I'm not sitting here with anger. I'm sitting here with clarity, which is something I should have had months ago." She said, "You don't know what you heard." I said, "Deborah, my hearing is fine." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "So what are you saying?" I said, "I'm saying I think we made a mistake, both of us. I think you came into this with a plan that had nothing to do with me as a person, and I think I let myself believe in something I wanted to be true. I'd like us to part ways before this becomes something worse." She asked about the house. She asked about her rights as a spouse. I told her I'd had that conversation with my attorney already and that I trusted him to handle things fairly and legally. I told her she was welcome to consult her own attorney, which was her right, and that I would not fight her on anything that was legitimately hers to claim. What she was legitimately owed was minimal. We had been married for 6 days. She left 2 weeks later. There were some difficult conversations, one of them involving Derek, who showed up unannounced one afternoon and sat in my living room telling me I was making a terrible mistake and that his mother genuinely loved me. I listened to everything he said. I thanked him for saying it. I showed him to the door. Tanya drove down the weekend after Deborah left. We sat on the back porch, and she didn't say "I told you so" even once, which took more restraint than most people possess. We just sat there in the November cold with cups of hot tea and listened to the wind move through the oak trees that Earl Hutchins planted 40 years ago. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I will be." She said, You were lonely, Daddy. That's not a flaw. That's just what happens. I thought about that for a long time after she left. She was right. I'd been lonely in the specific, particular way that you are lonely after 29 years of marriage, when the person who knew all your habits and understood your silences is just gone. That kind of loneliness doesn't heal clean. It heals crooked, and you learn to move around it. I had been so careful about the property. I had been so methodical about protecting what Lois's family built, and I had been so completely careless about my own heart, which turned out to be the thing most worth protecting. I'm back at the grief group on Tuesday nights. I sit in my usual seat. I don't know if I'll ever bring another woman home to those oak trees. Maybe I will. Hugh keeps telling me I'm not done yet, which is exactly the kind of thing Hugh says, and I've stopped predicting when he's going to be right. What I know is this: the house is still mine. The 12 acres and the duplex and the lease income and every dollar Earl Hutchins believed in. And Lois carried, and I have kept going through 4 years of learning to live alone. All of it is still exactly where it should be. And the next time someone asks me what I do in retirement, I'm still going to tell them I do handyman work and collect a pension. That part isn't changing. Some lessons you only need to learn once. I've thought about this a lot since Deborah left. Not obsessively, I'm too old for that, but in the way you turn something over in your hands when you're trying to understand the shape of it. What I keep coming back to is not the betrayal. Betrayal is loud, and it gets all the attention. But it's not usually where the real lesson is. The real lesson for me was quieter than that. It was about what I had chosen not to see, because I wanted so badly to see something else. I was lonely. I've said it plainly, and I'll say it again because I think it matters to say it without dressing it up. I was a 63-year-old man who had spent 4 years learning how to live in a house that used to hold 2 people. I was good at being alone in the practical sense. The bills got paid, the lawn got mowed, the gutters got cleaned before winter. But there is a difference between functioning alone and being at peace with it, and I had not crossed that line yet. Deborah walked into that gap, and I let her. That's not weakness, I want to be clear about that. Wanting companionship at 63 after 29 years of marriage is not a character flaw, but what I had let slide, what I had quietly, willingly let slide, was my own judgment. Tanya told me something felt off. Hugh told me something felt off. And I, a man who spent 34 years diagnosing problems before they became disasters, looked at both of them and said, essentially, I'd rather not know. That is the thing I've had to sit with. Not Deborah's plan, not Derek's questions about the acreage, not the conversation I overheard on a Sunday afternoon. Those things were Deborah's choices, and she'll carry whatever comes from them. What I have to carry is the fact that I had the information I needed and I decided for a season to set it down. There's a kind of intelligence that only works when you're willing to use it. You can be sharp, experienced, careful with money and property and practical decisions, and still walk yourself straight into something you should have seen coming because you wanted the feeling that came with not looking too closely. I know that now in my bones in a way I did not know it before. And here's what I think about the properties, about Earl's land and Lois's inheritance and all of it. Keeping those things safe was not the real victory. I kept them safe almost by accident, because I happen to have a habit of privacy that had nothing to do with wisdom. The real work, the work I'm still doing, is learning how to protect myself the way Earl taught me to protect land, with patience, with clear eyes, without letting what I want to be true get louder than what actually is. Tanya sat with me on that back porch, and she didn't gloat, and she didn't lecture. She just said I was lonely, and that wasn't a flaw. She was right about both things. But I'll add one thing she didn't say. Lonely is something you can survive. What's harder to survive is trading your own clarity for the temporary comfort of believing someone is who you need them to be. I still go to the grief group on Tuesdays. I still sit in my usual seat. I still make smothered pork chops sometimes on Sunday evenings just for myself, and they're still good. The oak trees in the backyard are still there. Everything Earl built is still standing, and I am paying attention now in a way I should have been all along.